Hi guys, it's Ramon Goose here, and in this video we're going to find out if Eric Clapton was ever invited to join the Beatles. Now, Eric's first encounter with the Beatles was in December 1964 when Eric was in the Yardbirds. In actual fact, the Yardbirds were one of the support bands for the Beatles at their Christmas show at London's Hammersmith Odeon. And in subsequent years, Eric would develop a friendship with Beatles guitarist George Harrison. It was on the 6th of September 1968 when George Harrison asked Eric to play guitar on his song While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Eric recalls his initial response: "I can't do that. Nobody ever plays on Beatles records." George managed to convince Eric to play on the track. He even had a guitar called Lucy, which was a gift from Eric, and a Les Paul ready set up with a Marshall. Eric thought the song sounded fantastic, adding, "I knew George was happy because he listened to it over and over in the control room." In fact, George Harrison recalled that Eric's presence in the studio also ensured that his bandmates tried a bit harder. They were all on their best behaviour. The Beatles carried out the remaining overdubs, which included an ascending piano motif played by McCartney over the introduction. The Hammond organ was played by George Harrison, and further percussion was played by Ringo Starr. McCartney also added a second bass part played on his Fender Jazz bass rather than his Hofner or Rickenbacker models. Eric requested that George Harrison give the lead guitar track a more beatly sound when mixing the song, because he was a little wary that his contribution might present too much of a departure from the band's sound. The guitar part was run through an ADT circuit with Varispeed, the engineer Chris Thomas manipulating the oscillator to achieve the desired wobbly effect. Lennon's tremolo-rich guitar part was recorded on 5th of September, was only retained for the song's coda. The song was released on 22nd of November 1968. Now, John Lennon never made it to the studio for that now famous session, so technically Eric has never recorded with the Beatles as a complete unit. However, on the finished track, it's Harrison on vocals and guitar, Eric on lead guitar, McCartney on piano and bass, and Ringo Starr on drums. One thing to notice, guys, was the song Bell Bottom Blues had a key change very similar to the song While My Guitar Gently Weeps. So Eric was very enamoured by George Harrison's songwriting. Later that year, Clapton shared the stage with John Lennon when the two performed at the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus with Keith Richards, Yoko Ono and Mitch Mitchell as the Dirty Mac. Eric delivered a masterclass at this show, and John Lennon was full of adoration for his guitar playing. Now, George's role in the Beatles was generally a straightforward one. He played the role of the lead guitarist, who stood behind the band's principal songwriters John Lennon and Paul McCartney. However, by 1969 the dynamic had altered, and George was no longer content to play second fiddle. On the Beatles' 12th and final record, Let It Be, the infighting and power struggle would eventually lead to George quitting the Beatles on January the 10th, 1969, and this was in the middle of Twickenham's Let It Be sessions. George was mainly frustrated that his growing songwriting talents were not acknowledged by McCartney or Lennon. Having spent much of the latter part of the previous year alongside Bob Dylan and the band working on tracks such as I'd Have You Anytime and his work with the Beatles' White Album, he felt that his creative input would be more welcome. McCartney's dominance over the group had been at its height on Sgt. Pepper's, and his overbearing nature had already forced Ringo into quitting once before, sending the drummer to Italy with heavy insecurities. Meanwhile, Lennon was falling deeper and deeper into his heroin addiction and was being propped up by Yoko Ono. As George states, "I can remember feeling quite optimistic. Thought, okay, it's a new year and we have a new approach to recording." George spoke about Paul McCartney's leadership role in Guitar World in 2001. He was on a roll, but in his mind, everything that was going on around him was just there to accompany him. He wasn't sensitive to stepping on other people's egos or feelings. Harrison put forth his own tracks such as Let It Down and Isn't It a Pity, and even the iconic song Something. However, Lennon and McCartney continued to shoot down the guitarist in favour of their own songs, and they weren't even bothering to listen to George's songs. On January the 10th, as cameras continued to swirl around the Let It Be sessions, George decided to quit. Michael Lindsay Hogg remembered the moment. He says, "We'd finished the first course when George arrived to stand at the end of the table. We looked at him as he stood silent for a moment. 'See you round the clubs,' he said. That was his goodbye. He left." In fact, George would channel his emotions into a song, writing one of the most iconic tunes on that very day, called Wah Wah. It was clear now that the group was only ever on a path to disbandment. Harrison recalls, "They were filming us having a row. It never came to blows, but I thought, what's the point of this? I'm quite capable of being relatively happy on my own, and I'm not able to be happy in this situation. I'm getting out of here." It became stifling, so that although this new album was supposed to break away from that type of recording, we were going back to playing live. It was still very much that kind of situation, where he had already in his mind what he wanted. Paul wanted nobody to play on his songs until he decided how it should go. For me it was like, what am I doing here? This is painful. Then superimposed on top of that was Yoko, and there were negative vibes at that time. John and Yoko were out on a limb. I don't think he wanted much to be hanging out with us, and I think Yoko was pushing him out of the band, in as much as she didn't want him hanging out with us. It was at this time that Lennon suggested replacing Harrison with Eric Clapton if he didn't return within a few days. Lennon responded to Harrison's departure, "Let's get in Eric. He's just as good and not such a headache." Lennon said, "If George doesn't come back by Monday or Tuesday, we can ask Eric Clapton to play." This prompted Ringo Starr to inquire why Clapton had left Cream. Lennon replied that Clapton would be pleased to join the Beatles, but that he left Cream because they're all soloists. He then went on to state that the Beatles would give him full scope to play his guitar. John went on to say that he wanted the band to continue with or without George, and would be willing to start his own band if necessary. Lennon continued, "Yes, if he doesn't come back by Tuesday, we get Clapton." George returned about 10 days later, and the Beatles would stay with this original lineup until breaking up the following year on April 1970. This conversation did eventually get back to Eric. In 1998 he commented on this. He says, "There may have been a suggestion that I would be asked to join the Beatles in January 1969. The problem with that was I had bonded or was developing a relationship with George, exclusive of them. I think it fitted a need of his and mine that he could elevate himself by having this guy that could be like a gunslinger for him. Lennon would use my name every now and then for clout, as if I was the fastest gun. So I don't think I could have been brought into the whole thing because I was too much a mate of George's." Lennon's continued admiration for Eric was evident in September 1969 when he recruited Eric for the Plastic Ono Band. Lennon would actually make an offer in the form of a lengthy letter pleading with Eric to join his band with Yoko Ono and Phil Spector in 1971. "You must know by now that Yoko and I rate your music and yourself very highly, always have. You also know the kind of music we've been making and hope to make. Anyway, the point is, after missing the Bangladesh concert, we began to feel more and more like going on the road, but not in the way I used to with the Beatles, night after night of torture. We mean to enjoy ourselves, take it easy, and maybe even see some of the places we go to. We have many revolutionary ideas for presenting the shows that completely involve the audience, not just as superstars up there blessing the people, but that's another letter really. I'll get more to the point. We've asked Klaus Voormann, Jim Keltner, Nicky Hopkins, Phil Spector even, to form a nucleus group, Plastic Ono Band. Between us, all would decide what augmentation to the group we'd like, e.g. sax, vocal group. They are all agreed so far, and of course, we had you in mind as soon as we decided." Now, in another letter written in 1971, Lennon said, "Eric, I know I can bring out something great, in fact greater in you that had been so far evident in your music. I hope to bring out that same kind of greatness in all of us, which I know will happen when we get together." In another passage it says, "At least think about it, don't be frightened. I understand paranoia only too well. I think it could only do good for you to work with people you love and respect you. And that's from all of us. Lots of love to you, both from John and Yoko." It's a bit unclear who all of us refers to, but as this letter was from 1971, it was most likely his new project, the Plastic Ono Band, rather than the Beatles, who had officially broken up in 1970. Lennon called on Eric for his 1969 recording Cold Turkey, written by Yoko Ono, and released under the Plastic Ono Band. Ringo Starr later teamed up with Eric for his 1976 song This May Be Called a Song, which Eric wrote. And decades later, on Never Without You in 2003. Paul McCartney teamed up with Eric on the 9/11 tribute song Freedom in 2001, and later with My Valentine. Let me know in the comments, guys, if you think that Lennon was just shooting his mouth off, or if he actually did really mean for Eric to join the Beatles. Okay guys, thanks for watching this video. This is Ramon Goose signing out. See you soon.